He was the kind of pilot people trusted without question. In his small town, he had built a reputation for steady hands and calm judgment. He wasn't reckless, wasn't chasing adrenaline the way some younger flyers did. He had flown for years, logging hundreds of hours over fields, hills, and the same winding rivers that ran like veins through the valley. For him, the sky wasn't a thrill. It was routine. On the morning of his final flight, nothing about his behavior raised alarm. He drove to the airfield at the same unhurried pace, greeted the mechanic on duty with a nod, and inspected the aircraft like he always did, circling it carefully, checking each bolt and hinge. The plane was a lightweight trainer, a model he had flown many times before. The weather was clear, winds low, visibility stretching for miles. By every account, it was the perfect day for a short training loop. He filed a simple flight plan, an out-and-back route that should have taken less than an hour. Those who watched him taxi across the strip remember how ordinary it looked. The sun caught the silver of the fuselage, the propeller blurred, and then he was airborne, another dot in the sky, another flight indistinguishable from the hundreds before. His voice on the radio was calm, almost casual. He reported his heading, confirmed altitude, and said he'd be back within the hour. The tower logged his transmission and went about routine duties. No one suspected that those words would be the last they would hear from him. As the morning drifted into afternoon, the airfield carried on with its quiet rhythm. A few hobbyists fueled their planes, a small group of students practiced takeoffs, and the radio operator marked the passage of time. But when the clock pushed past the point of his expected return, the first twinges of unease surfaced. A delay of 10 or 15 minutes wasn't uncommon. Pilots often circled a little longer, tested maneuvers, or simply enjoyed the sky. Yet as the minutes stacked into nearly an hour, the operator picked up the headset and tried to reach him. The calls went unanswered. At first, there was no panic, just irritation, a sense that maybe he had forgotten to update his plan. But as the daylight began tilting toward late afternoon, the mood shifted. By then, the airfield expected to see his small plane banking into view, aligning with the strip, touching down with the same precision he was known for. Instead, the horizon remained empty. When the operator radioed again, the silence on the other end stretched long enough to feel ominous. Others joined the attempts, broadcasting his tail number, calling his name. Nothing came back but static. Word spread quickly. Mechanics left their work bays, instructors cut lessons short, and local flyers offered to scan the skies. People gathered at the edge of the runway, eyes lifted, searching for any trace of him. The first search planes lifted off before dusk, circling the area in widening arcs. They scanned tree lines, riverbanks, and open fields, but no flash of metal broke through the green below. On the ground, sheriff's deputies began mobilizing volunteers. The pilot's family was contacted, their questions multiplying faster than the answers could keep pace. By nightfall, worry hardened into fear. The routine flight that should have ended with the squeal of tires on tarmac had instead dissolved into uncertainty. Searchlights swept over roads leading out of town. Officers questioned locals who might have seen or heard the aircraft, and radar logs were pulled to pinpoint its last known position. Witnesses stepped forward with fragments of memory. Some insisted they had seen the plane flying low near the northern ridge. Others swore it veered east toward farmland. Each claim contradicted the last, spreading investigators thin. For the people waiting at the airfield, the minutes dragged into hours. Every time a distant engine echoed across the sky, hearts leapt, only to fall when it turned out to be another search craft. His wife arrived at the runway, pale and tight-lipped, clutching her children close as deputies explained what little they knew. She asked the same questions on repeat. Had he radioed? Was there engine trouble? Was he injured but alive somewhere out there? No one had answers. By midnight, search operations became urgent. Helicopters equipped with floodlights hovered low over valleys. Crews leaned out with spotlights scanning for wreckage or fire. Ground teams formed lines through dense woods, calling his name, listening for any response. The night was heavy with silence. No beacon, no smoke, no debris. It was as if the plane had vanished mid-air. The community that had always trusted his steady presence now found themselves staring at an impossible absence. Farmers left their homes to walk the fields by lantern light. Fishermen swept along riverbanks and neighbors offered boats, trucks, anything to aid the effort. Still, nothing surfaced. As dawn broke, fatigue set in, but so did the grim reality. A man who had flown the skies with confidence and routine was missing without explanation. The first 24 hours ended with no trace, and while the search was just beginning, whispers already stirred, because planes don't simply disappear. The second day of the search began before sunrise. Helicopters from the State Patrol lifted off as soon as the light allowed, their rotors churning the cool morning air. From above, they traced the pilot's planned route, scanning the valleys and ridges that stretched like a patchwork quilt below. Observers pressed their faces against the glass, straining to catch the glint of aluminum, the unnatural shape of wreckage against the earth. But from the sky, the landscape gave nothing back. Every field looked ordinary, every tree unbroken. On the ground, deputies organized search teams into tight grids. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through forests, pushing aside brush, marking their progress with colored tape so they wouldn't cover the same ground twice. ATVs roared down dirt trails, and dog handlers brought in trained search canines. The animals pulled eagerly at their leads, noses pressed to the wind, but their circles widened and fell quiet without a solid scent. Along riverbanks, boats moved slowly, their engines idling as spotters leaned over the side scanning for debris, oil slicks, or bodies. Hours of combing turned up nothing more than driftwood and reeds. At the airfield, investigators turned to data. They pulled radar logs from the nearest aviation tower, replaying the timeline of aircraft in the area that afternoon. Dozens of blips appeared and faded across the screen. Commercial jets on high-altitude routes, a handful of regional prop planes, and scattered private craft. His tail number registered clearly for the first portion of his flight, steady on course, nothing unusual. Then, just past the 30-minute mark, the signal wavered. It dipped suddenly, as though the plane had lost altitude, then vanished entirely. Technicians ran the logs again, certain it was a glitch, but the result was the same. His plane simply disappeared from radar. Theories began to circulate almost immediately. The most likely explanation, investigators reasoned, was mechanical failure. A sudden loss of power could have forced him into an emergency landing somewhere beyond the radar's reach. Pilots trained for that scenario, finding a field, cutting throttle, gliding down, survivable if luck held. But if he had gone down in thick forest, the canopy could have hidden both wreckage and fire from aerial view. The second possibility was medical collapse. He had no known health conditions, but investigators couldn't ignore the chance of a heart attack or stroke mid-flight. Alone in the cockpit, that would have left no one to stabilize the craft. Still, darker theories whispered at the edges. Had he deliberately flown off course? Pilots had vanished before, leaving behind debts, affairs, or private struggles they never revealed. His family denied it outright, insisting he was a man of duty, not someone who would abandon his life. Yet detectives were trained not to take anything at face value. They quietly began checking financial records, speaking with acquaintances, digging into the background of a man now defined as missing. Witnesses complicated things further. Dozens of tips poured in. A farmer swore he had seen the plane banking low over a tree line near the northern ridge. A hiker claimed he spotted it veering sharply east as though trying to avoid something. A fisherman insisted he heard a sputtering engine above the river, followed by silence. Each account conflicted with the next, sending search crews scattering in different directions. They checked the ridgeline, they checked the farmland, they scoured the banks of the river. But the soil was undisturbed, the trees unbroken, and the water undisturbed by wreckage. By late afternoon, tension seeped into every corner of the operation. Volunteers argued about which direction to prioritize, deputies pressed locals for more precise details, and the pilot's family stood on the sidelines in growing despair. His wife clutched his flight jacket, repeating over and over that he wouldn't have left them, that something had gone terribly wrong. The children watched silently, their eyes scanning the sky, perhaps still expecting him to appear overhead. Nightfall brought more urgency. Helicopters fitted with infrared cameras returned to the air, sweeping dark hillsides with beams that cut through shadows. If wreckage smoldered anywhere, if a body radiated warmth, the cameras should have detected it. They found nothing. Searchers on the ground lit flares to guide their way through thick underbrush, their voices echoing as they called his name into the darkness. It was a strange kind of silence that answered, too complete, as though the landscape itself had swallowed sound. Hours dragged into the early morning, fatigue dulled sharp eyes, yet still no discovery broke the monotony. The deputies marked maps with colored pins, areas cleared, areas left to cover, but the gaps were endless. The plane had to be somewhere, they reasoned. A machine of metal and fuel didn't simply evaporate, yet with each passing hour, the absence of wreckage seemed almost unnatural. By the time the second night ended, frustration mingled with dread. Theories remained theories, tips remained conflicting, and the physical evidence amounted to nothing. The pilot who had taken off in broad daylight had not returned, and every logical path to finding him had gone dark. For the searchers standing in the chill air of that second night, one question loomed larger than the rest. How could a plane vanish so completely without leaving even a trace? When days of searching bled into weeks without discovery, the vacuum of truth was quickly filled with speculation. In small towns, silence rarely lasts long, and this silence was deafening. At first, people whispered questions quietly in grocery lines and church pews. But soon, the rumors grew bolder, shaping themselves into theories that spread faster than official reports could keep up. The most common was the simplest, that he had chosen to vanish. A man could start over if he wanted to, change his name, slip across borders, and build a life free from responsibility. Maybe, some argued, he had done just that. The idea gained traction because it carried just enough plausibility. Investigators learned that the pilot had been carrying some financial weight. Small debts had accumulated over the years, nothing massive, but enough to cause strain. The bank had sent letters, and his accounts showed signs of overdraft. Neighbors recalled him tightening his belt recently, selling off equipment he once swore he'd keep. To some, it painted a picture of a man cornered, perhaps desperate for a way out. Others took the theory further. If he hadn't vanished to escape debt, maybe he had been involved in something darker. Stories of smugglers using small aircraft weren't uncommon in the region. Drugs, contraband, even stolen goods could move quietly across rural skies, far from commercial flight paths. A few locals whispered that he may have been drawn into that world. They pointed to his experience in the cockpit, his knowledge of remote airstrips, his ability to fly low and unnoticed. The plane, they said, might not have crashed at all. It might have landed where no one was looking, emptied its cargo, and never come back. For his family, these suggestions cut deep. His wife attended every press conference, her voice steady, but her hands trembling as she defended him. She insisted he wasn't that kind of man, that he had no secret life hidden behind the one they shared. He was a father, a husband, a member of the community. He fixed his neighbors' fences, volunteered at the airfield, and spent weekends at home, not in bars or backroom deals. The children, too young to understand the politics of rumor, clung to the simpler truth that their father had promised he would return. Yet detectives couldn't dismiss the darker possibilities outright. When a man vanishes with his aircraft and leaves behind no trace, every angle has to be examined. They dug into his financials, confirming he was behind on payments, though not deeply enough to suggest ruin. They looked into his associations, interviewing colleagues at the airfield, mechanics, students he had trained. No one admitted to seeing signs of illicit activity, though a few admitted he had grown quieter in the months before his disappearance, more withdrawn. Privately, investigators also examined the state of his marriage. Those closest to the family painted an image of stability, but a closer look revealed cracks. There had been arguments, some neighbors recalled, voices raised late at night. His wife confided that they had been under stress, both financial and emotional, though she denied it was anything that would drive him away. But detectives knew from experience that desperation sometimes hid beneath ordinary facades. To them, the combination of financial pressure and marital strain was enough to keep the possibility alive, that he might have seen the flight as an escape route rather than a simple training exercise. As weeks passed with no wreckage, the community began to fracture along the lines of these competing theories. Some supported the family, standing by the belief that the pilot was the victim of a tragic accident yet to be uncovered. Others muttered about betrayal, that he had walked away and left his loved ones to carry the burden of questions. A few went even further, suggesting conspiracies, that someone else was involved, that the plane had been tampered with, that a debt collector or hidden enemy had forced his disappearance. The sheriff's department tried to temper the noise, but even within their ranks opinions varied. Some deputies leaned toward accident, convinced the wreckage would eventually turn up in an overlooked ravine or under dense canopy. Others saw too many gaps in his personal life to ignore. The lack of a distress call, the absence of debris, the clean break, all of it fit the narrative of a man who simply never intended to return. Meanwhile, his family lived in a state of suspended reality. His wife kept his belongings untouched, refusing to move on or declare him legally dead. Birthdays passed with an empty chair at the table, anniversaries with a silence that grew heavier each year. The children asked fewer questions as time went on, but their eyes still searched the skies when small planes buzzed overhead. For them, rumors were more than idle talk. They were daggers twisting in wounds that never closed. By the end of the third month, the official search had been scaled back. Without physical evidence, without wreckage, investigators could only chase shadows. What began as a clear and confident mission had devolved into theories built on speculation, each more divisive than the last. And in the absence of answers, one truth was unavoidable. Whether through accident, choice, or foul play, the man and his aircraft were gone, leaving behind a community drowning in questions that only deepened as time dragged on. When the physical search yielded nothing but exhaustion and dead ends, investigators turned their focus inward, away from the hills and forests and into the records. Aviation leaves behind a paper trail and an electronic one, and sometimes the answers to what happened in the sky aren't written on the ground, but hidden in the faint signals that flicker across radio channels and radar screens. The first task was to comb through every piece of communication logged the day of his flight. At first glance, the records looked routine. He had filed his plan, departed on schedule, and made a standard check-in shortly after takeoff. His voice was calm, clipped, and precise, as was typical for him. After that, silence. But buried deeper in the logs was something investigators hadn't caught the first time. Around the moment radar lost his plane, a faint broken transmission appeared. It was a single burst, little more than static, but within the distortion were fragments of words. Some analysts swore they could hear him saying "going down." Others insisted it was meaningless interference, a common artifact on busy frequencies. The audio was replayed again and again, each listening producing a different conclusion. Experts were brought in to clean up the recording. They isolated the signal, ran it through filters, and slowed it down. In the enhanced version, the syllables became clearer, though still not definitive. To some ears, the voice said "engine." To others, it sounded like "turning." A few thought it was nothing more than clipped noise. The ambiguity only deepened the mystery. If he had been trying to call for help, why hadn't the words been clearer? And if it wasn't his voice at all, why had the burst coincided so precisely with his disappearance from radar? The radar data itself told its own troubling story. His flight path had been steady until it wasn't. The logs showed a sudden, unexplained altitude drop. Not a slow descent, as might happen during a controlled landing, but a sharp dip, steep enough to indicate trouble. Then, just as suddenly, the signal vanished. Air traffic controllers explained that small private planes sometimes dropped off radar if they flew too low, especially in hilly or forested areas. But the timing, altitude loss followed by silence, suggested something more catastrophic. Armed with this data, search crews redirected their focus. They calculated where a plane losing altitude at that speed might have gone down, and they canvassed the projected path. Helicopters circled the zones again, this time flying even lower. Ground crews pushed into deeper sections of forest, cutting paths through thickets where before they hadn't dared. Volunteers combed along the creeks and marshes in case the aircraft had ditched in water. Each sweep returned nothing but silence. The land gave up no secrets. The lack of physical evidence began to eat away at confidence. If he had truly lost control, the wreckage should have been there, within the narrowed search corridor. Planes do not simply dissolve mid-air. Even in the densest canopy, signs remain: broken branches, burn marks, displaced soil. But nothing surfaced. After weeks of concentrated searching, not a single piece of debris, not a scrap of metal, not even a trace of fuel was recovered. It was as if the radar had captured the final act of a tragedy that had never touched the ground. The conflicting interpretations of the radio burst added to the frustration. To the family, the recording became an emotional battlefield. His wife clung to the belief that he had called for help, that the static-laced syllables proved he had fought to the last second. Others in the community dismissed it, preferring to believe it was an accidental overlap of frequencies. The debate left them polarized, between those convinced of an accident and those beginning to suspect something more sinister. Detectives, caught in the middle, cataloged every angle. If the transmission was real, it pointed to mechanical failure, a failing engine, a desperate pilot trying to make a last call. If it was interference, then they were back to square one, with no clear explanation for the sharp altitude drop. Theories spiraled from there. Some speculated about a catastrophic in-flight breakup, though that should have left debris scattered across miles. Others hinted at the possibility of tampering, that the plane had been disabled intentionally. With no evidence to anchor them, every possibility remained on the table. Weeks later, the official report offered little comfort. It documented the altitude loss, the sudden disappearance, and the ambiguous radio fragment. The language was clinical, restrained. Possible in-flight emergency, it read. Cause undetermined. Wreckage not located. It was a conclusion that satisfied no one. For the investigators, it marked a case that hovered between categories. Not accident, not crime, not certainty. For the family, it was another reminder that the man they loved had simply vanished into silence, leaving behind only static and numbers on a screen. As months passed, the ghost in the records became the defining feature of the case. The search had been exhaustive, the terrain thoroughly canvassed, and yet the records remained the only trace of his existence in those final minutes. For those who believed in accident, the ghost was evidence enough. For those leaning toward darker possibilities, it was proof of a cover-up or a manipulation they couldn't yet name. Either way, it left the case suspended between explanation and enigma, unable to tip toward resolution. And in that vacuum, darker theories would soon take deeper root, pulling the family and the town into years of suspicion and division. As the weeks turned to months, the search effort inevitably shrank. What began with helicopters, grids of volunteers, and the hum of urgency gradually thinned into small, half-hearted patrols and the occasional lead that fizzled out before it started. By the third month, the sheriff's department admitted what no one wanted to say out loud. There was nothing left to find. The official case was still open, but the resources were gone. Search teams stopped mobilizing, helicopters stopped circling. The only people still out there, combing the ridges and riverbanks, were his family. His wife refused to accept silence as an answer. She drove to the sheriff's office almost weekly, demanding updates, filing missing person reports again and again, even though they were already on file. Her persistence wasn't because she thought the paperwork would suddenly conjure answers. It was because doing nothing felt like giving up. She taped flyers to telephone poles until the paper yellowed and curled in the rain. She called news outlets, begged for follow-up stories, and pleaded with private pilots to keep an eye out when they passed over the countryside. At night, when the house was quiet, she sat at the kitchen table with maps spread across it, tracing possible routes he might have flown, looking for gaps in the search. It became her routine, her fight against a silence that threatened to swallow him completely. The children lived in a different kind of limbo. At first, they asked every day when their father was coming back. Birthdays, holidays, even ordinary afternoons became measured by his absence. As the years rolled forward, their questions grew less frequent, but the void never closed. One child grew quiet and inward, holding on to the memory of the man who had tucked them in at night. The other became restless, angry, prone to trouble at school. Teachers described them as distracted, but the truth was simpler. They were living a life where answers never came, where certainty never arrived. The community, too, was torn apart. In the early days, there was sympathy, donations of food, and circles of prayer. Neighbors brought casseroles, mowed the family's lawn, and promised they were not alone. But as time wore on and the mystery remained unsolved, sympathy soured into suspicion. Some whispered that the pilot had abandoned them deliberately, that his wife was covering for him, that the family knew more than they let on. Others defended them fiercely, insisting that to speak that way was cruel, that tragedy should not be met with judgment. Friendships strained under the weight of those divisions. Each anniversary of his disappearance became a ritual. His wife organized candlelight vigils at the airfield, standing under the same sky he had vanished into, her children beside her. A few dozen townspeople came the first year, fewer the second, and by the fifth year only a small circle remained. But she never skipped. Every year she lit a candle, held up a photograph of his smiling face, and begged the public not to forget. To her, remembering was the only weapon against losing him entirely. For the children, the anniversaries were painful milestones, reminders of what they had lost and how little the world seemed to care anymore. Behind closed doors, the family carried the burden in silence. Bills piled up, the mortgage strained against a single income. His wife took on extra shifts at work, juggling grief and survival. At times, she considered filing for a legal declaration of death, which would unlock insurance money and provide financial relief. But the thought made her sick. To sign that paper would mean admitting he was gone forever, and as long as she refused, there remained a sliver of hope that he might walk through the door. She chose hardship over surrender. Detectives occasionally dropped by, usually with little to report. They admitted privately that the trail had gone cold. No wreckage, no body, no definitive evidence meant the case existed in limbo, much like the family itself. Theories continued to swirl: accident, escape, foul play. But with nothing tangible, they could only offer platitudes. Each visit ended the same way: the detective closing a notebook, the wife staring at the floor, her children hovering nearby, listening for clues in conversations that yielded none. Seasons changed, years turned, but the absence never dulled. For the family, life became an endless negotiation between memory and survival. They learned to celebrate birthdays without him, to live through Christmas mornings with his chair empty, to graduate school without his applause. But the silence always lingered. The question of what had happened never faded. It only grew heavier with time. And still, the town remembered in fragments. When small planes droned overhead, some would glance up and mutter his name. When farmers found a piece of metal in their fields, they wondered briefly if it could be part of his plane, only to toss it aside when it proved to be scrap. He was gone, but never entirely. His story hung over the community like an unfinished sentence, impossible to ignore, impossible to conclude. For his family, the real torment wasn't grief, it was uncertainty. Grief has a beginning and, however slow, a path forward. Uncertainty has no edges, no closure. It only circles endlessly, reopening itself at every memory, every milestone, every anniversary. And as the case cooled in dusty files at the sheriff's office, the family was left to live inside that uncertainty, alone with questions that seemed destined to outlive them. As years stacked one after another, the case refused to fade completely. It became the kind of mystery that lingered in the background, surfacing whenever someone swore they had stumbled onto something. Every so often, a tip would come in, enough to reignite the old questions, enough to send investigators scrambling, only to collapse into disappointment. The missing pilot was no longer just a man, he was a ghost that the county could not put to rest. The first false lead came from a pair of hunters deep in the mountains. They claimed to have seen the outline of a fuselage through the trees, half buried in brush and rock. The sheriff's office assembled a team, hiking for hours through dense terrain to reach the coordinates. When they arrived, all they found was a rusted logging vehicle abandoned decades earlier. From a distance, its skeletal frame had mimicked the shape of an aircraft. The hunters apologized, embarrassed. For the family, the news was another knife, hope raised, then torn away. Months later, hikers reported a wreck high along a ridgeline. They had spotted metal jutting from the hillside, twisted and sharp. This time, the community held its breath. Helicopters were dispatched, and recovery teams scaled the slope. What they found was indeed an aircraft, but not his. Records showed it had gone down in the 1970s, its pilot already accounted for. The family of that long-lost aviator was contacted, and their grief was revisited. For the missing pilot's family, the discovery was another cruel reminder that someone else's closure was not their own. The years stretched forward, and with them came wilder stories. A trucker passing through another state swore he saw a man who looked identical to the missing pilot eating at a roadside diner. Detectives followed up, pulling security footage from the diner. The grainy video showed a man of similar build, but not him. Another rumor claimed he had been living under a new name in the Southwest, working odd jobs and staying off the grid. The lead collapsed when the so-called match turned out to be a drifter with no connection at all. Yet each rumor kept the embers of speculation alive, because if he could be spotted alive somewhere, then maybe he hadn't been lost to the earth after all. Detectives described the case as a recurring ghost. Every time they thought it had settled, it rose again in the form of a tip, a rumor, or a supposed sighting. And because no wreckage had ever been found, they could never dismiss these tips outright. The absence of evidence left every door cracked open, forcing them to chase possibilities that logic should have closed years earlier. The pilot was everywhere and nowhere, alive and dead all at once, depending on which rumor you chose to believe. One of the cruelest leads surfaced nearly a decade after his disappearance. A farmer clearing land came across twisted metal buried under years of soil. The sheriff's office was called, and investigators rushed to the site, heartbeats quickening with the thought that the mystery might finally end. The metal was indeed part of an aircraft, but closer inspection revealed it belonged to a crop duster that had crashed years before. The owner had long since salvaged what he could and abandoned the rest. Once again, the excitement deflated into nothingness. For the family, each false lead was a cycle of torment. His wife would answer the phone, her voice trembling, as detectives informed her of a new possible discovery. She would cling to the sliver of hope, only to crumble when the truth came back empty. The children, now older, learned to shield themselves from the highs and lows, refusing to believe anything until proof was undeniable. They had grown tired of hope being dangled in front of them like bait, only to be yanked away. Meanwhile, the town adapted to the rhythm of the case's ghostly resurgences. People learned to exchange cautious glances whenever a new rumor surfaced, asking quietly if this would finally be it. But deep down, most had stopped believing closure would ever come. The story had woven itself into the town's fabric, not as a tragedy with an ending, but as a permanent wound. Detectives cycled in and out of the case as the years passed. New officers inherited the files, poured through the same records, and came to the same frustrating conclusions. The plane had vanished. The man had vanished, and without physical evidence, no theory could be eliminated. Accident, escape, foul play, each was kept alive by the sheer absence of proof against it. For investigators, it became less of a case and more of a haunting. They carried it with them like unfinished business, a constant reminder of the limits of their work. Even as new generations grew up and the family aged, the story was never fully silenced. It lingered in the quiet spaces of conversation, in the looks exchanged when planes droned overhead, in the weary sighs of deputies opening the dusty case file yet again. The pilot who vanished had become more than a missing man. He was a riddle that refused to resolve, a ghost without a grave. And though the family's grief dulled into endurance, the absence remained sharp, because every false lead promised an ending that never came. 17 years is long enough for a story to fade from headlines, but not long enough for it to fade from memory. The missing pilot had become a kind of folklore in the valley, spoken of in hushed tones, a mystery folded into the rhythm of daily life. For the family, his absence was a constant shadow. For the town, his name evoked unease, a reminder that some questions simply refused answers. And then, almost without warning, the silence cracked open. It began in the spring, after heavy seasonal floods. The river swelled beyond its banks, spilling water into low-lying fields before retreating and leaving behind thick silt and broken soil. Farmers moved in to assess the damage, their boots sinking into damp earth. One of them noticed something strange near a shallow depression, metallic shards scattered across the surface. At first glance, he assumed they were remnants of old farming equipment, the kind that often rusted into pieces underground and resurfaced after storms. He tossed a few aside without thought, but one fragment caught his attention. It was curved, painted faintly in a color too bright to belong to old plows or harvesters. Curiosity led him to dig deeper. What he pulled from the earth was not the jagged edge of a tractor part, but a small section of riveted aluminum. Nearby, another farmer bent down and unearthed a long, twisted rod. When they wiped away the mud, they recognized the shape, a wing strut. The weight of what they were holding pressed heavily between them. And then came the discovery that left no room for doubt, a corroded piece of propeller blade, jagged and rusted but unmistakable. This was no farm relic. This was part of a plane. The farmers called the sheriff's office immediately. Within hours, deputies arrived, followed by state investigators. The field, once just another stretch of farmland, was cordoned off with tape as word spread quickly. Old-timers who had been around during the original search whispered to each other in disbelief. Could this be the wreck that had eluded them for nearly 2 decades? Could the missing pilot have been here the entire time, hidden beneath their feet? Investigators brought in survey equipment and excavation crews. The soil was soft from the floods, easier to dig but fragile enough that every movement had to be careful. Piece by piece, fragments of fuselage began to emerge from the earth. Some were warped, others snapped clean, but together they told the unmistakable story of an aircraft buried deep. The discovery triggered a rush of emotions, shock, relief, and dread colliding all at once. For years, people had speculated about him vanishing by choice, running off to a secret life, or being pulled into something criminal. Now, the metal in the soil suggested a simpler, more haunting possibility, that he had never left at all. News crews descended, setting up along the edges of the field. Reporters who had once covered the disappearance now returned with gray hair and heavier voices, marveling at the resurfacing of a mystery they had long considered frozen in time. Neighbors drove out to stand at the fence line, watching silently as the excavation continued. The pilot's family, older now, thinner from the years of grief, stood apart from the crowd. His wife clutched the hand of her now-grown child, eyes locked on the muddy trench where investigators worked. 17 years of unanswered questions pressed down on her shoulders, and for the first time, it seemed possible she might finally hear the truth. By the 3rd day of excavation, the outline of the wreck began to take shape. Crews uncovered sections of wing buried at odd angles, twisted as though the earth had folded them inward. The cockpit area was still obscured by mud, but enough had surfaced to confirm beyond doubt this was the missing pilot's plane. The very aircraft that had lifted into clear skies nearly 2 decades earlier had come to rest in a field less than 20 miles from the airfield. Somehow, despite years of searches, it had remained hidden, swallowed by soil and water until nature itself revealed it. The discovery didn't answer everything. Not yet. It raised new questions. How had they missed it? Why had no one noticed the impact? And most of all, was he still inside? For investigators, the wreck was a breakthrough. For the family, it was the beginning of a reckoning. The silence of 17 years had ended, but the story was not finished. As they watched the muddy bones of the plane pulled into daylight, they braced themselves for what the earth might give up next. Excavation of the field moved slowly, almost reverently. The soil was thick and damp from the floods, clinging to every piece of twisted metal the crews unearthed. Investigators insisted on a careful approach. After 17 years of waiting, no one wanted to risk damaging what remained of the aircraft, or anything, or anyone that might still be inside. Heavy equipment was kept at a distance. Instead, workers used shovels, brushes, and even their hands to clear away the layers of earth that had entombed the wreckage for nearly 2 decades. As more of the fuselage emerged, the picture of the crash grew clearer. The plane hadn't scattered into pieces the way some had imagined. Instead, it had buried itself nose first, swallowed by the marshy ground. The impact had forced the body of the craft deep below the surface, where silt and roots slowly covered it year after year. Branches had grown across it, roots had curled around the frame, and the soil had hardened into a coffin. To those standing at the edges of the trench, it was eerie to realize that for 17 years, the missing pilot had been lying just beneath farmland tilled and walked over countless times. On the fourth day, crews reached the cockpit. The twisted nose of the plane was lodged at an angle, the glass shattered long ago and filled with mud. Investigators gathered silently as the soil was cleared, revealing the outline of a seat harness. The straps, brittle with age, still cradled what remained of a body. There, strapped into the pilot's seat, were skeletal remains. For a moment, no one spoke. The sight was stark, chilling, but it was also undeniable. The man who had once soared confidently into clear skies had never left this place. The discovery rippled outward in waves of shock. Deputies secured the site, forensic specialists stepped forward, and the family, who had been warned to stay back, stood frozen at the sight of investigators moving with sudden urgency. The remains were carefully lifted, piece by piece, still partially clad in tattered scraps of fabric that had once been clothing. Alongside the bones, personal effects began to emerge. From the mud, an investigator pulled a rusted wristwatch, its face cracked but still faintly legible. In another pocket, they found a wallet containing a pilot's license, the paper faded and warped, but intact enough to confirm his name. The evidence was irrefutable. After 17 years of doubt and rumor, the missing pilot had finally been found. News spread like wildfire. Reporters who had covered the story in its earliest days returned to stand at the edge of the field. Cameras trained on the muddy pit that had become the town's most important discovery. Headlines declared the mystery solved, but for the family, it was more complicated than that. The sight of his personal belongings, items they remembered him wearing and carrying, was both a relief and a crushing blow. It confirmed what they had feared but could never admit. He had not run away, had not abandoned them. He had been here all along, waiting for them to find him. The town reacted in waves of emotion. For some, the discovery validated long-held beliefs that the disappearance had been an accident, not a conspiracy. For others, it brought shame for the years of suspicion cast on the family. Theories that he had fled with debts or vanished into a criminal life were silenced by the stark evidence of his final resting place. But even as relief settled in, new questions rose to the surface. How had searchers missed the wreck for so long? How had the radar and flight path analysis pointed elsewhere, while his plane lay hidden in plain farmland less than 20 miles from the airfield? Investigators remained cautious. They confirmed the identity publicly only after forensic teams matched dental records to the remains. The press conference was brief, almost clinical, but its impact was shattering. The sheriff stood at the podium, voice steady but low, and announced that the missing pilot had been located. Behind him, the family stood in silence, faces pale and hollow, clinging to each other as cameras flashed. They had waited nearly 2 decades for answers. Now that the answers had come, they found themselves drowning in the weight of them. Excavation continued for days afterward, pulling out larger sections of the fuselage, engines, and twisted framework. Each piece was catalogued, photographed, and sent for analysis. But the most important discovery was already made. The man at the center of the town's greatest mystery had been found in the very place he fell. For the community, the moment was both closure and reckoning. It forced them to confront how quickly speculation had turned into suspicion, how easily whispers had branded a man as unreliable or guilty without evidence. Standing at the fence line, older residents admitted quietly that they had once believed he had run off. Now, seeing the mud-stained license and the skeleton strapped into his seat, they felt the sting of regret. 17 years of rumor had ended in a field, in the rusted remains of a plane that no storm or lie could keep buried forever. The town was stunned, the family broken yet vindicated, and investigators left with a new question. What exactly had happened inside that cockpit to send a cautious, skilled pilot into the earth without a trace? Once the wreck was pulled from the earth, the real work began. Forensic specialists from the National Transportation Safety Board arrived, their task not simply to confirm identity, but to reconstruct the final moments of the flight. Every fragment of twisted aluminum was laid out on tarps, every scrap of wiring and shattered instrument carefully tagged. What had once been a single sleek machine was now a jigsaw puzzle of rust and decay. The investigators approached it with the same patience they would any crash, because even after 17 years underground, the evidence still told a story. The first clues came from the fuel system. The recovered tank showed severe corrosion, but residue samples revealed it had been nearly empty at the time of the crash. That discovery shifted the narrative. A mechanical failure had been suspected for years, but the empty tank suggested something more basic. The plane had run out of fuel. For investigators, that explained the sudden altitude drop captured on radar and the faint static-laced radio burst. He may have been circling, disoriented, desperately searching for a safe place to land when the engine finally sputtered into silence. Attention then turned to the soil itself. Geologists and forensic technicians studied the field where the wreck had been found. Core samples revealed layers of compacted silt and clay, evidence that the land had once been marshy before being converted into farmland. In those conditions, a heavy object like an aircraft could be swallowed quickly, sinking deeper with each season of rain and flooding. That explained why search crews had missed it in the early days. From the air, the marsh concealed impact scars. On the ground, water and shifting soil buried the wreck before anyone could stumble upon it. Over time, crops grew over the site, roots weaving themselves through the fuselage until nature had hidden the evidence completely. Inside the cockpit, investigators found little left intact but enough to provide answers. The seat harness had been secured, confirming he was still at the controls when the plane hit the ground. The injuries reconstructed from skeletal remains pointed to blunt force trauma consistent with high-speed impact. There were no signs of escape attempt, no evidence of foul play. The crash had been immediate and fatal. Forensic anthropologists ruled out prior injury or struggle. Whatever happened in those final moments, it ended the instant the plane struck the marsh. Investigators also studied the instruments, though most were shattered and corroded. The altimeter had frozen at a low altitude, consistent with a last-second descent. The compass was jammed, but it too suggested erratic headings. Combined with the fuel evidence, the picture became clearer. He had likely been circling off course, trying to reorient as the engine sputtered. Without enough fuel to recover, he was forced into a desperate attempt at a landing, one that ended in the marshy soil where his plane dug itself a grave. The forensic report was clinical, yet its implications were deeply human. For years, the family had endured whispers that he had abandoned them, that he had run away or lived in secret. The report eliminated those theories entirely. He had not left by choice. He had fought until the last moment, strapped to his seat trying to save the aircraft. The wreckage confirmed what his wife had insisted for nearly 2 decades. He was a steady, reliable man, undone not by scandal, but by circumstance. Still, questions lingered. Why had he not landed sooner when fuel levels began to drop? Investigators speculated that weather conditions, while clear at departure, might have shifted unexpectedly at altitude, creating haze or disorientation. Others suggested he may have miscalculated his reserves, circling too long during practice maneuvers. There was no evidence of intentional negligence, only the kind of small compounding errors that turn routine flights into tragedies. For the town, the forensic findings were sobering. Theories of smuggling, staged disappearance, or hidden enemies evaporated in the face of hard science. What remained was simpler, if more haunting. A cautious, skilled pilot had become lost in the sky he trusted most, betrayed by empty fuel tanks and the hidden geography of the land. His body had not been taken by conspiracies or secret lives. It had been taken by the earth itself, buried so completely that even the most determined searches could not uncover it until nature itself shifted. When officials held their final press briefing, the words were clinical but heavy with finality. Cause of death, blunt force trauma consistent with aviation accident, manner, accidental, no foul play suspected. The wreckage, they confirmed, would be transported to a secure facility, but the remains would be released to the family for burial. After 17 years of questions, the case was no longer listed as open. For the first time, the sheriff's office stamped it closed. The town absorbed the news quietly. For those who had once pointed fingers, the findings were humbling. For those who had defended him, it was bittersweet vindication. And for the family, it was both a relief and a heartbreak. They finally had proof that he had not abandoned them, proof that he had fought until the end. Yet the reality of how it ended, the violence of the impact, and the long years he had spent hidden beneath their very feet, weighed heavier than any rumor ever had. 17 years of silence had finally given way to answers. But as investigators packed up their equipment and reporters turned their cameras elsewhere, one final chapter remained, the act of laying him to rest, and with him, the years of doubt and suspicion that had haunted everyone who had ever wondered what became of the man who never returned. When the final report was filed and the wreckage cleared from the farmer's field, the mystery that had stretched across 17 years came to rest with an answer that was both simple and devastating. The pilot had not staged a vanishing act. He had not crossed state lines under an assumed name, nor had he carried cargo for smugglers or fled from hidden debts. He had been a man who took off for what should have been a routine flight, who encountered the kind of disorientation and bad luck that strips away even the most experienced flyer's margin for error. Poor visibility near the ground, an empty fuel tank, and a marshy field that swallowed evidence whole had conspired against him. He had been there the entire time, entombed in silence while the world above speculated about who he was and why he had disappeared. For his family, the truth was both a relief and a renewed heartbreak. His wife clutched the watch recovered from the cockpit, staring at the cracked face as though it were a window into the moment everything stopped. For 17 years, she had lived under the weight of suspicion, neighbors whispering that he had left her, acquaintances suggesting she knew more than she let on. Now the evidence proved what she had always insisted. He had not abandoned them. He had died, still trying to return. Yet vindication offered little comfort when paired with the reality of what had happened, how close he had been to home, how cruelly the earth had concealed him. His children, now grown, stood at his graveside with memories blurred by time. They remembered him in fragments, the smell of his jacket after long flights, the sound of his voice calling them in for dinner, the way his hand felt heavy and protective on their shoulders. For years, those memories had been poisoned by doubt, twisted by the possibility that he had chosen to disappear. Now they could reclaim him. He had not been a deserter or a runaway. He had been their father, a man undone not by betrayal, but by circumstance. They buried him with photographs tucked into the casket, trying to bridge the 17 years lost between who they had been when he vanished and who they had become when he was found. The burial was small, private, no reporters, no speculation, no cameras pressing in for one last headline. Just family, a few close friends, and the minister's quiet words carried on the wind. The casket lowered into the ground felt like the closing of a wound that had never properly healed, but also the reopening of grief that had been suppressed for too long. Tears mixed with relief. For the first time, they knew where he was. For the first time, they didn't have to wonder if he might walk through the door. The silence that had stretched across nearly 2 decades had finally spoken, and it had spoken with finality. The town, too, was forced into reflection. For years they had filled the gap of evidence with stories, building their own explanations to soothe the discomfort of the unknown. Some had branded him irresponsible, others deceitful. Now those theories collapsed under the weight of fact. He had been a victim of weather, disorientation, and the land itself. The whispers stopped. Conversations turned instead to apologies, to regret over the doubts they had cast, and to quiet acknowledgement that they had all been wrong. The pilot who vanished had not been a ghost of suspicion, but a casualty of chance. In the sheriff's office, the dusty case file was finally stamped closed. The deputies who had inherited the mystery from their predecessors admitted to a strange emptiness. For years, the case had hung over them like unfinished business, haunting their desks and their consciences. Closing it did not erase the 17 years of false leads and restless speculation, but it offered something rare in cases like this: resolution. They placed the file back on the shelf, knowing it would likely never be opened again. Forensic experts, when asked, described the crash as a confluence of small errors magnified by bad luck, A missed calculation on fuel, a patch of haze near the ground, and a marshy field that concealed everything until floods disturbed it. There was no malice, no crime, no hidden life. Just a man who had done his best until his options ran out. It was a sobering conclusion, made heavier by the years it took to reach it. 17 years of speculation had finally ended, not with a twist, not with scandal, but with the quiet truth that he had been there all along. The earth had kept him hidden, the silence had kept his family in torment, and the passage of time had kept the wound open. Now, with the wreck recovered and his body laid to rest, the silence was no longer empty. It had spoken the truth, and though that truth was hard, it was also the only path forward. For his wife and children, grief mixed with relief. They could finally stop searching. They could finally stop defending his name against rumors. They could finally say goodbye. The silence that had haunted them for nearly 2 decades had become an answer, and with that answer, they found a measure of peace. The pilot who never returned to the airfield had never left them by choice. He had been waiting beneath their feet the entire time, resting in the quiet of the earth until the day nature itself decided to reveal him.